Mary Kay Wilmers' parents met in 1935 on the HMS Aquitania, sailing from France to New York. She was playing ping pong. He asked if she'd give him a game. Charlie Wilmers was English, born of German Jewish parents, and did a lot of business in America. Sasha Eitingon was born in Poland into a family from Belarusia who did a lot of their business in Leipzig. She was living in Moscow when the revolution broke out, and in America at the time she met Charlie. Mary Kay is from a family that's used to doing a lot of moving about. She lived in Long Island as a child, then in Brussels, went to school in England. After university, she went straight to Faber and Faber, then worked as Carl Miller's deputy at the Listener and the TLS. During the Times lockout in 1979, she and a small number of like minds, including Frank Kermode, who died this week, started up the London Review of Books. Since 1992, she's been its editor. I joined the paper in 2001, by which time Mary Kay was in the habit of spending some of her time with great reluctance away from the office, working on a book about her family. This book, The Eitingons, a 20th-century story. Reading it now, it's quite hard to believe she ever finished it. It takes in enormous swathes of 20th-century history, from the Pale of Settlement at the turn of the century, the Russian Revolution, American labor relations in the 1920s, the early history of psychoanalysis in Vienna and Berlin, Russian Secret Service activity in Turkey, China, Spain, climatically in Mexico, on into the Second World War, and then the development of the bomb and the Cold War. And that was the easy bit, it seems, because the difficult thing was trying to work out what the various members of her mother's family were up to in all those times and places. Mary Kay, I was there for the end of the book and those several years of final pushes. But I know very little about its beginnings. It must have had lots of different starting points, not only in the decision to actually write the book, but also deeper in the past than that, in the stirrings of a certain kind of interest in your family. And I was wondering, could you talk a bit about that, and at what point your interest became a documentary interest, if you like?
Well, I'm always a bit nervous about this because the beginnings of the book are so shallow. I was interested in my immediate family. I was interested in the difference between my mother and my father and how I fitted into that. But I never really considered myself part of my mother's family because I was so heavily invested in my father's family. And really the story of the book came up because there were these pieces, first in the New York Times, then in the New York Review of Books, about the Eitingons, because one of them was a KGB assassin and another one was a psychoanalyst, and there was a theory that the psychoanalyst had worked with the assassin. And I was very taken, well, first of all, I wanted to write a book. I wanted to have a subject. Secondly, I was very taken with the idea that a psychoanalyst could be quite evil, that he could work for Stalin, that he could lead a double life. I thought that was really an entrancing possibility. I don't think it worked out quite like that, but anyway, so that was what impelled me to do it. Was also, since my mother was effectively Russian, I'd heard a lot of Russian when I was a student. I was a languages student, but a rather reluctant languages student because I thought history was more interesting, but I was good at languages, so I did languages. And so I did Russian because I thought I'd be an interpreter at the UN and have a very wonderful life, till someone pointed out that it's really boring to be an interpreter. But I stuck with the Russian and then I forgot it. And I think like a lot of multilingual people, I was really more interested in English and in correcting English and getting English right. And I think that it's quite a sort of suitable background for an editor to know lots of different languages, and then it obsesses you with one, I think. Where was I?
Well, you were talking about...
So the Russian thing was then when Glasnost happened, I thought, oh my God, I always say I know Russian, but actually I don't know any Russian, and I'm going to be found out. So I started doing conversation with a woman who'd recently arrived from the Soviet Union. And so I told her she told me about her life, I told her about my life, I told her about the story of these people. the killer and the psychoanalyst, and she was interested and she sort of facilitated it, and then I took it up, and then I got involved, and then it was too interesting to let it go, and it seemed so extraordinary, and it was still the late 80s, the early 90s. The Soviet Union was such a mysterious and interesting thing. So that's the genesis of it.
Yeah, and that project of recovering language actually turns out to be a much more involved process of recovering histories which maybe can't be recovered. I mean, we'll talk much more about that, I think. But the psychoanalyst and the assassin you're talking about are Max Eitingon, psychoanalyst,
Yeah.
Leonid Eitingon, the assassin. You talk about the original article by Stephen Schwartz was about whether or not Max was that
Yes.
too, was a spy too. But the third character, if we can call him that, in the book is Motty Eitingon. And actually that inquiry as to who was and who wasn't the spy ends up locating itself just as much around him. Before we lose these people, because we're going to end up talking about Leonid, everyone always does when we talk about the Eitingons. So let's talk about Max and Motti first. Motty Eitingon, how are we going to talk about him?
Marty Itengon was my mother's uncle. I knew him. He was the only one I knew. He was very present in my childhood. He was very, very charming. It was always, I said that my brother was charming like him and I wasn't. That registered quite strongly. He was incredibly, he had a connection with the Soviet Union that at the time of the revolution he was arrested. He was arrested in 1918 as an international capitalist or something. He was already in the fur business. His uncle was in the fur business. He married his uncle's daughter, thus consolidating it. And he went to America. He had after he was released, he went from Poland to Sweden to Germany to boom, 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 to the States. He set up there, but he had connections with the Soviet fur industry, and so he got the concession for Siberian mink that in vast quantities. And then the question is, what favors did he do in return? Did he facilitate Leonid's? The Soviet Union needed a lot of foreign currency. Leonid's work needed a lot of foreign currency because he worked abroad. He did his assassinating abroad. So what helped to him was Motti. What helped to the Soviet Union generally was Motti. I don't know, the FBI were interested. They pursued it in a rather foolish way. I mean, they had a phase where they went through his rubbish and that sort of thing. They interrogated him. But then in the 50s, after Stalin died, when there was an article in the Saturday Evening Post that mentioned Leonid Eitingon, they didn't make the connection. One FBI official said, "Oh, Eitingon, is that a common Russian name?" Asked the question, but didn't take it any further. So they never quite found him out. Anyway, he made a lot of money, he lost a lot of money, and the puzzle to me, apart from whether or not he worked with the Soviet Union, was how did he seem to be so very, very rich when I was a child? When reading through the New York Times, which was my main source for him, he seemed to have no money and always to be in debt. That's a mystery I am quite incapable of answering.
Reading the book, the story of Motti is one of the gaining of a vast fortune and then the losing of that fortune. It's also a story about a family falling in love with Motti and then in some sense falling out of love with him, and that has a lot to do with his charm, and that notion of his charm and the inquiry into his spying seem very closely related to me. It seems to me that you toy with the idea, at least, that he can only have been a spy if he was living a double life to a really extraordinarily rigorous degree. And it's his charm that enables you even to entertain that idea. I've got a passage here just from the middle of the book, which I'll quickly read. I'm going to read instead of you. Do you want to read?
No.
Could I hand it to you? You're talking about a photograph which is included in the book. And you say, "I've looked at this photograph now and then and come to feel that despite the frankness of the expression and the openness of the face itself, this is a portrait of an unknowable person. I don't mean that something inconceivable was hidden away behind the affability. a long career in espionage, for instance, or murder or adultery, only that charm is a way for a person not to be there.
That's true. So what you...
It seems to me that unknowability, that it's the charm and your growing suspicion of it, that suspicion of his charm also becomes a suspicion that there might be a possibility that he has a double life.
But if you're that charming, you're that charming to everyone. So you're charming to the Soviets and you're charming to your business associates until you're not. And it seems to me, I mean, it is a way of being there. It's a thing to hide behind. But it seems to me that charm and espionage go together very well. And actually what's puzzling about Leonid is that he seems so uncharming and yet to be such an effective agent.
How does Max fit in there?
Max, I don't find him very charming. There's a dispute in the family, I mean a dispute, it's not a dispute, but different people now dead said that he was very charming and that he was the only member of the family who wasn't charming. He had a lot of money. His father was the original fur, well, they were all in furs probably forever, and I think most Jews from the Pale of Settlement were in fur anyway, but certainly my family was. His father made the big business that was worth 25 million marks in 1928. So he had a lot of money. He gave a lot of money to Freud. Freud said of him that it was only by giving presents that he could deal with the world, and certainly the other analysts, they didn't like him. I think I say at one point that were he English, I would say it was a class difference, but it isn't quite that. I don't know what it is, but he was so much Freud's favorite, whether he was Freud's favorite because he set up the Berlin Polyclinic, he set up the publishing house, he gave Freud lots of presents, he got his tobacco for him when it was difficult to get it. Whether that was why Freud liked him so much, I don't know, and why the other... He obviously wasn't so good at being charming because the other people weren't charmed by him.
I know a bit more about him than I do about Stalin, but it seems to me there's a real parallel between Max's relationship with Freud and Leonid's with Stalin, in the sense, you know, that they're both masters in a position. They both have favorites. They both have them temporarily. Freud used to be in the habit of falling in love with his male devotees and then giving up on them really quite quickly. But he doesn't do that with Max. No. Max hangs in there almost uniquely, it seems to me, and as Leonid does almost uniquely in Stalin's trajectory.
I don't think that Stalin knew Leonid. I think he just thought he was an effective operator. Also, Leonid's boss was quite charming. He was very good looking and quite charming, though not so much when I met him, but he was very good at ingratiating himself, and Leonid's family said that his boss was the one who got on with his superiors, was always going to say, I'm going to see Stalin, I'm going to the third floor, whereas Leonid apparently didn't bother with any of that sort of stuff. He was the man of action and the fighter, and they complemented each other quite well in that way.
Let's talk a bit about Leonid's CV. Well, I don't know. I mean, we can list his highlights of his career quite quickly, can't we? I mean, they are quite striking, quite startling.
He was a young man in the Civil War who distinguished himself quite early on. Would be given desk jobs, and every time protest and say, I don't want a desk job. He was quite self-willed, and at one point they took away his party membership because he was obviously insubordinate, and then they gave it back to him because they needed him. He's said by somebody who was associated with one of his sisters, after Perestroika wrote a piece in the Israeli paper Maariv about him, saying that as a young man he'd rounded up all the local Jews and put them in the synagogue and then shot them all. And his mother thought that there might even have been some of her relatives among them, and then she was going to not forgive him, but then she found that it was simpler to forgive him. So he went from there. It's said that Dzerzhinsky really liked him and sent him to the military academy in Moscow. From there, because he was good at languages, he was sent to China. I mean, the point about that is the Jews did very well in the KGB and all its earlier incarnations because they were good at languages and quite sort of educated, and sort of contrasted with the Russian peasants, and so promoted not, I mean, you weren't allowed to not like them, or you weren't allowed to discriminate against them, though I don't suppose they were particularly liked. Anyway, he went to China. He made mistakes, and yet he was always forgiven his mistakes, which was sort of inexplicable. I don't know why, because most people, they made mistakes, they were executed, and he wasn't. He made some mistakes in China. From China, he went to Turkey, where Trotsky was.
He begins to follow Trotsky at that point, is that right?
Yeah, but not everywhere. I mean, he didn't go to Norway when Trotsky went to Norway, but there was a fire in Trotsky's library. His archive was burnt. Or his books were burnt, but his archive was saved. That's it. And anyway, so he was there, but he left before Trotsky did. He went to Spain. He was quite active in the Civil War, and that's where he recruited the man who actually put the ice pick into, or no, knocked Trotsky on the head with the blunt end of the ice pick. That wasn't really an ice pick, it was more an ice axe. It was a bigger thing.
There are facts in this book, after all.
There are facts, yes. And I've remembered some of them.
At the LRB recently, we've noticed a tendency to increasingly absurd subtitles. But I think it's worth taking yours seriously, the Eitingons, the 20th century story. I'm wondering what that means. You're describing three men, Motti, Max, and Leonid. You describe them as men of their time. You also say about the Russian singer, perhaps Russian agent Plevitskaya, that she had a very 20th century career. Now, I'm not going to ask you to give you a grand thesis about the history of the 20th century, but I am wondering in what sense the story you're telling could be thought of as a 20th century story.
Well, you could say that the main battleground of the 20th century was in Eastern Europe. So in that sense, it's a 20th century story. It's also, mercifully, it's not, though it's a story about Jews, it's not a story about the Holocaust, which is in every way a great relief to me, the obvious way, and lots of subsidiary ways. But communism and the ideology that went with it, the idealism that went with it, the hope, well, the utopianness, the hope for a different world, a better world, a more equal world, that's all a 20th century story. You could tell how much it's a 20th century story by thinking what things are like now. And then the mobility of the Jewish family that when this family started out, the Jews they spoke only Yiddish, and they didn't believe, I'd not say my family, but in general, there were Jews who didn't believe that America existed because it wasn't in the Talmud. Is the Talmud the right book, or the Old Testament, one or the other? And then they turned into this polyglot set of people who were distrusted because they were so cosmopolitan. And they moved from east to west, they changed identities along the way, they assimilated. And again, if you compare that with now in identity politics, and indeed if you can think about Jews now and Israel, think how different that is from what they were like. So in that sense, it's a 20th century story.
it's also history told in a particular kind of way. I mean, I have quite a difficult set of questions or a difficult set of subjects to talk about here, because I'm wondering what it means to write the history of the 20th century as a family history, what it enables you to do that maybe can't be done in more universal histories.
Well, you mean it enables you not to know the facts?
That's what I would like to talk about that, actually, about not knowing.
Well, I don't know, but my son said, when I said you were going to ask me that, I told my son said, well, knowing the facts, that's a male thing.
You're a feminist historian.
I'm a feminist historian.
Well, you do make a virtue of not knowing. You ask questions that you can't answer, or which can't be answered.
I don't understand this, because if you don't know, what do you do?
That's the question.
The book was reviewed in the New York Times, and it was a nice enough review, but said it was so irritating, my way of saying this may have happened, on the other hand it might not have. Then I looked at the bottom of the piece. The man who wrote the review had written a novel about Stalin. Yeah. I don't know what you do if you don't know what you do.
Yeah, I mean, a novel, like an authoritative history, are two different versions of telling a complete story and pretending that you do, in fact, know the entirety of the universe that you're dealing with. You really don't do that, and there is a tremendous negative capability in the book for that reason, I think. There's something powerful that comes out of statements like, referring to the fire that you've talked about on Principe, you say, there was no evidence that it had natural causes, and no evidence that it didn't. And in another place you say, I'm not saying it did, and I'm not saying it didn't. Now, that's not just having it both ways, and it's not just giving up on the historian's task. There's something there which is stated and also thrown into irresolution in a way that's actually quite enabling and powerful, it seems to me. It seems to me you're making a point, or at least you could be making a point if you weren't going to be modest about it.
Well, I could say things like, I'm a very uncertain person, but that wouldn't get us anywhere. I could say, if you work at the LRB and you think, oh my God, Eric Hobsbawm might read this, what am I to do?
But you're not going to save yourself from Eric Hobsbawm's wrath if you just say you're not really sure. You know, it's a much more positive manoeuvre to me, it seems. And, you know, let's take that idea seriously, that it's not men's history in that sense, that it's not written under the sign of authoritativeness and seriousness and certainty, but is under the sign of uncertainty, of irresolution, of essential irresolution. These things can't be answered. How many historians are prepared to admit that?
I don't know. I'm really interested now that everybody's pointed out that I'd do this irritating thing. I'd like to know whether other historians are so sure of what they say.
I'm sure they aren't, but I'm sure they cover their tracks in various rhetorical ways, which
historians.
aren't yours.
I'm not a historian.
You are a historian. You have written a book of an extraordinary book of history here. I mean, I think of forgive me, it is in the book. I think of your mother, a woman of feeling, as you describe her, of contradiction, uninterested in the past, of her tushing you away when you ask any questions about it. And then of your father, rational, objective, uninterested in surmise. You refuse both of those possibilities. You are interested in the past, and you are interested in surmise, and you do like to puncture objectivity. And
yes.
I've seen you do that in other places too. So I'm wondering whether it isn't, in fact, your approval to historians, as well as to your parents, to write history this way. And is that what family history makes possible? You know, you can imagine someone faced with the overwhelming uncertainty of history to core, writing about their family, because at least that will give you some ground. You'd at least know what took place in your family. It's almost the reverse in your book. History is written very self-assuredly, but the family history turns out to be obscure and a place of not knowing. It seems to me that when you write about your family, you're really saying, look, you can't even know about this. Even this is unknowable. There is a kind of final irresolution here.
Well, I've got the history from other books, so I assume they know what they're talking about. The family bit, I don't know. It's true that while my father was alive, I didn't dare say anything because he always shot it down. So then after he died, I found it was possible to say all sorts of things and wing it.
There's a lot about myth-making in the book, it seems to me. I mean, in a sense, what you're doing when you're investigating these various characters, all three of them really, is trying to investigate a myth. There are two stories right at the end of the book. There's one about, you play a transcript of Leonid's children talking about him to someone else, a Russian woman, the one who got you started on the book, I think.
Yeah.
And she says, oh, you know, this is the kind of way that people used to talk about Lenin at school. And then, right at the end of the book, you have a story about your mother when she died, and you were filling in forms, and there was information on the forms which turned out to be unreliable. What was that information?
My mother died in Geneva, and there were various unreliabilities. She was a very unreliable woman in her way. The central one was that she had a British passport because of being married to my father, and it said that she was born in Lodz, or if you prefer, Łódź, and then in brackets, Grande Bretagne. And the man showed it to my brother, the undertaker, and my brother, he showed him the whole form. My brother passed it, handed it to me, and I said, no, Lodz Łódź is in Poland. And then I asked my brother afterwards whether he would have left it, and he said yes.
Why did he say that? Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
But it
And there's also a question about the date when she was born.
Well, my mother was born in 1907. My father was born in 1909. When we were children, it was a tremendous secret. My mother had lied on her passport, put that she was born in 1909. It was a tremendous secret. You weren't supposed to tell anyone. It was the darkest thing imaginable that she'd lied on her passport, and that she was a year and a half older than my father. Then, at a certain point, she got tired of it. She was like that. So she reverted to 1907. So the Swiss authorities got into a big state about that. It was also always said that her birthday was on the 30th of May, and that when we were children, when I was a child, the 30th of May was an important date because it was my mother's birthday, and anyway, May's a nice month, and one thing and another. Then it turned out that the record came back from Poland. Unbelievably, they had a record, and they said she was born on the 14th of October, 1907. So, you know, what do you know?
Well, exactly what do you know? Exactly what do you know? And it turns out that at the very ground of this story there is a knowability. And so when you write these very thorough histories actually now of Leonid and Motti and Max, there's always an instability, precariousness, it seems to me, in the book between whether you're building a myth or building on a myth or trying to puncture a myth. And that's the tension that holds the book together, it seems to me.
The other thing I thought about Leonid is people pressed me, historians pressed me to find out more about Leonid, to try and get into more of the archives. The archive was fairly open in the late 80s, early 90s, and then it closed, particularly under Putin. So you couldn't find out more. And I got into a state thinking, I'm never going to finish this book, I'm old, I'm not going to finish it if I try and find out everything there is to know about Leonid. I'm going to have to leave it open. And it's probably the same for all three of them. And that's another reason why things are not resolved. Also, the book is quite long as it is. So it had to be done in the context of the family and what was knowable.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned secrets just there already in relation to your mother. You don't dwell on the notion of the secret as a philosophical thing in the book, but it's nonetheless the case that the secret and the keeping of secrets is one of the most important threads winding the stories together in the book. There are the secrets that the three characters have in their professions, Motti's financial secrets, secrets in psychoanalysis, of course, all the time, espionage.
Well, there's Max's quite exciting secret, which was, there was a movie about that. I mean, not Max's part in it. Oh, now what's he called? Who made Claire's Knee? What's he called? Roma made a film about the story of the singer and the general. I can't remember what that was called either, but so there is that story. That seems to me quite a significant secret that he kept, or Max, the dutiful psychoanalyst, the faithful follower of Freud, was involved with a Russian singer. I mean, I don't think he was sexually involved, but again, he gave her presents and bought her clothes, bought her husband a car, and then it turned out that her husband was in this émigré milieu, the white Russian milieu in Paris, where everybody was white or red or both and nobody knew. Her husband was responsible for abducting. He probably was red, the other one probably was white. He abducted the white one, who ended up dead in Moscow, and he ran away. Her husband ran away and was finally killed in Spain, maybe by Leonid, but she was caught and put on trial. And she didn't finger Max at her trial, but she said that he dressed her from head to toe. And this story went on. It was quite a big story in Paris in the late 30s. And Max was involved with her. He didn't tell Freud. He didn't tell Freud the extent of his involvement, which is what makes him suspect. He probably didn't do anything, but maybe he did. Why didn't he tell Freud? Why didn't he tell Freud that the couple, the general and his wife, had seen him and his wife off at the station a few days before the kidnapping? I mean, that's a mystery. Who knows?
Well, Max, modest Max, as you call him in the book, it remains more obscure to me than the other figures. I mean, what you go quite deeply into the question of whether Motti might have been a spy, and what, if he were gathering information, what his motivations might be. They seem more obscure with Max, don't they? What would his involvement in the politics or the ideology of the situation
that is completely unclear. The thing that's clear about him and quite tantalizing is that he was always away. That was one of the things the other analysts held against him. He was always on holiday. And he would be traveling from Sicily to northern Italy to Vienna. Why? Because his wife was ill. Because in the days before the Second World War, that's what people did. They were ill, they traveled. Well, that's what rich people did. Or there was more to it, or he was doing Lenin's business. There's a book by that man, Alexander Etkin, who said that Stalin paid for Soviet psychoanalysis, and that Max was the conduit.
I see, okay. I mean, given that you're talking about secrets, trying to uncover family secrets and trying to uncover secrets of various kinds in the lives of these men, it wouldn't have been surprising, and it wouldn't be surprising in a memoir in general, if psychoanalysis had organized your thinking, or if you'd appealed to those ways of thinking for metaphors, at least, for thinking about memory and secrets. But it doesn't, actually. Instead, it seems to me that in your book, spying is the thing. That's the thing which provides you with your economy of the secret. I mean, we've talked already about Leonid and the centripetal pull that he exerts in this book, but it seems to me that very often the secrets you're trying to find out in this book are not the secrets of their formation or their personality or what they were really like. They're about the involvement they may have had with Leonid and with Stalin. I mean, the other scene in this book is not the unconscious, it's the Soviet Union.
Well, the Soviet Union is more interesting to me than the unconscious. I don't know. I thought earlier when
and yes, as you say in the book, you've been involved in analysis in your lifetime.
I have, yes.
You know, there's a certain you probably have engaged at least as directly with Freud as you have with Marx, and that's the other encounter. That's the other 20th century encounter in this book, by the way, between Freud and Marx. But and yet, the Soviet Union. It fascinates you more. It draws you more.
It's more interesting, and I thought about it when I was trying to think this morning. I thought, well, if you grew up as a child in America in the 40s and 50s, the Saturday Evening Post world, which my parents were very, very unlocal. They really didn't know local. And so the whole world of Saturday Evening Post would have been really intriguing to me. And the Soviet Union was rather like that. You know, the photographs of young pioneers and their scarves and all that, it is it's the same sort of thing as the Saturday Evening Post world of 1950s America. Sort of calm, reassuring everybody, knowing who they are, what they were supposed to be doing. I agree that's not more interesting than psychoanalysis, but
it might well be.
More within my capability.
We're certainly less used to it. It's very unusual, that choice you've made. I mean, it seems to me to write a memoir, a family memoir, not by the lights of psychodynamic thinking or tracing the past in that kind of way, but in the way that you have done, means that once you've embraced espionage as your guiding light, as your way of thinking about secrets, you commit yourself to a very particular way of thinking and of writing as well. You know, is it possible to know anything in that economy? Which seems unlike in history, which would be about isolating what the most likely possibility was and then somehow getting closer to the truth. When you're thinking in terms of spying, you hold all possibilities in your mind at any one time and fear all of them. And that's in a way how you write about Motti and Max too. You hold all the possibilities in mind at any one time and fear that any of them might be true or that none of them are. And I suppose what I'm asking is whether your fascination with Leonid has not only dictated the path your research took, but has also affected the way you write the book. You find yourself thinking about the characters not as Freud would, but as Stalin might have, you know.
Well, it's the sort of, you know, editorial authoritarianism. Well, because it was basically it started off as a book about Leonid. I mean, it was Leonid who people had no chance of knowing about, as I thought at the time. You think, wow, a relative of mine, I ring up his son's house and say, are we related? I mean, in 1988, I mean, that to me is just an amazing thing to have done. I wouldn't have thought it of myself, or go into the Lubyanka. I mean, now nobody knows what the Lubyanka is or was, or whether it's still called that, but to me, I could, you know, if I'd climbed Annapurna, it would have been more surprising, but not a lot more.
Well, I mean, that raises the question, for me at least, I mean, about your place in this book. I mean, very early on, wondering about why people keep letters, you ask whether it's out of a need to memorialise themselves, I'm quoting you now, out of a need to memorialise themselves, or because they don't want to discard their past. Now, it's an easy inference to say that that's what you're doing in this book, except that the stories you're telling aren't yours, they're these people's. And then you also write very near to that, you think you're interested in their story, only to discover you're obsessed with your own. Which made me wonder immediately in what sense you think these people's past, these stories that you're telling, are your past.
I think that's a bit of lazy writing, really. I think I was looking through my aunt's letters. I didn't think I should write the book. My family didn't want me to write it, so I felt rather bad about doing it. I then, at the beginning of the book, there's a story about how I stole, steal isn't quite the right word, but I nicked some letters from under my cousin's nose, basically. And then read about myself and found that the letters were rather uncomplimentary. And so I'm not sure how that attaches to the book.
I'm not either. I think it attaches in very complicated ways, but the thing is, it's chiming with something that's a bit of a bugbear for me about
lazy writing?
No, nothing to do. It's certainly not lazy, because the reason I'm quoting those sentences is because they're so great, and there's another one coming up in a minute, but there's something that bothers me a lot about the current fad, and it may turn out to be much more than a fad for genealogy, and this comes from all sorts of places. It's not just in the number of memoirs that we're seeing now, and memoirs that come from places that didn't used to come. That probably has something to do with what some people might understand as postmodern, post-colonial entitlement for people to tell their stories. There's something also about the human genome and the way in that makes us think about inheritance and wiredness in ways that I find completely bewildering. There are other manifestations of this, and some really debased ones, like the TV program Who Do You Think You Are, which I especially loathe. This is the program which people seem to have reached some kind of moral crisis because their great-great-great-great uncle may have been implicated in the slave trade. Or, best of all, Jeremy Irons being absolutely inconsolable because he finds out that he isn't, after all, Irish. And you know, I find it, I think partly because mine isn't a family in which these sorts of stories aren't told, in which there isn't actually a lot of interest in the past, and it's also because I don't belong to the kind of family where stories like yours are told, but I don't think about my own formativity in that way at all. But you do say, you say something wonderful actually, talking about how people talk about photographs of your father. You're pleased with how they do that, and you say, as if his being so good looking were an achievement of mine. And that's something like those moments, but it's also a commentary on those moments. It punctures it, because of course you realise it isn't an achievement of yours, and that isn't how we can think about formativity. And yet, more than once you say, Leonid, he was a relative of mine, as if, you know, my God, what does that mean? What does it mean that he was a relative of mine? How are you implicated in all these stories that you're telling? Are you? Do you want to just say you're not?
I don't really feel I am. I mean, I have my notion of my having a bad character, and so being related to an assassin is a sort of, an objective ability or something.
You are impressed with Leonid.
I'm impressed with somebody who can go out and do things. Yeah, I am.
Whatever those things are.
It also, he believed in what he was doing. I mean, I find that quite difficult too. But I met an Eitingon relative in New York the other day whom I'd never met, and a woman who in 1988 would have been horrified at this book being published said, "Are there more assassins? I heard there might be."
That feels like a very post-Soviet possibility.
It does, but the whole thing just becomes a comedy.
Isn't there always that about Stalinism? This is one of the ways in which people talk about Stalinism as against Nazi Germany, for example, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Well, even
there.
Robert Conquest's book, he makes it all sound comic in the end. There's so many killings. Of course, it's not at all comic, but Stalin was so amazing in the way he killed people that in the end it does have a I mean, obviously it doesn't, but it does also have a humorous aspect.
Or a dimension of the absurd, perhaps.
Quite, yeah. Yes.
We haven't got very much time left, so I think I should turn you over to the audience. Is there anything that anyone here wants to ask Mary Kay, or any observations people want to make? I'm going to take some time and not panic if no one puts their hand up.
I'm going to better ask something. Oh. Oh God, can't one of my colleagues ask a question?
We should have planted some. In the middle there. Do we have a microphone, or? Oh, we do.
Is it Joe? No. Oh, no, good. It's a question for him.
No, this is definitely a question for you.
What's it like working for an editor?
No, with an editor.
With an
You had
editor.
to work with an editor on this book. What was that like for you?
Oh, he just asked me a few questions, and some of them I pretended to answer, and some of them I didn't pretend to answer.
This was a place where you'd worked.
Yes, I did work at Faber. I thought that's probably why they published the book. Yes, I had.
They must have been scared as hell of you.
When? Then?
There's no way they would have treated you with the same insouciance that they might have treated others. Not that they would at Faber ever, of course, but at certain publishers, they must have had a certain kind of respect and fear of you that they wouldn't have had for other authors, I would moot.
I didn't get a lot of sense of it, I can tell you. I got my way with something, with the jacket.
On the writing?
On the writing? No, I took his question. He then got another job, so it was quite easy. He didn't check out.
We're only going to get so far with that question, I think. Anyone else? Here at the front. And then over there.
because a lot of them live in America, have sort of public careers, basically didn't want to be associated with the KGB, and even less with an assassin. And I think they thought that it could damage their career prospects. And even now, I was quite anxious about calling the book The Eitingons, thinking, it's not my name. I'm not exposing myself. It's a lot of other people's name, and they might mind. There's a sort of usurping, and then you always feel, or at least I feel, if you write a book, you're doing it for your own glory, you're doing it at other people's expense, you know, at the expense of people who are called Eitingon, who might not find it quite as amusing or intriguing as I do to be related to an assassin, but now it turns out it's fine, and we all want to be related to assassins.
But how did the Russian Eitingons, the Leonid's family, react to
Leonid's family, I don't dare think about them. The main character, the one I admire most, I was quite relieved that she died before the book came out, because they have their way of seeing it. I think I've been I've been snobbish about some of them, and I regret that, because that was pointed out to me. It was too late, and I wasn't really thinking about them, and that was a bit wrong. But for the people I did think about, I was very, very faithful to what they told me, and I listened to the transcripts and translated them with my friend, and I very much wanted to give their impression of him without being too sarcastic. I don't know, I didn't want to be, but obviously if a family glorifies one family member like they did Leonid, but also if you say how grumpy he was, and then you say, well, what did he do all day? Well, he just sat and smoked. You know, that just by reproducing he sat and smoked, you're maybe not honoring him. You're trying to reproduce their honoring of him, but you're not honoring him yourself. And I feel uneasy and don't very much want to see them now.
There was a question over here, I think.
It's a question about the feeling that I have, and I wonder if you had, that the period of time in which I've been lucky enough to live has been a relatively peaceful and, in that sense, unglamorous time. And when I look at the lives my family led in the past, through no choice of their own, they were glamorous, perhaps in an awful way. And I would just be interested to hear you think about that, about these extraordinary lives that you've described, with the European wars, with Stalin, with the epic quality. And you have had a life full of achievement, but it's a different scale of epic for those of us.
I mean, it's another thing I thought about before this. I mean, I'm quite conscious of being part of the lucky history of certainly of 20th century Jews. Very, very few members of my family were caught up in the Holocaust, and we, the Eitingons, but also my father's family, we made our way out to the West. On the other hand, there's a sense of, I mean, the Cold War was very important to me, I realize, and no doubt had I been grown up during the Second World War, it would have been the same sort of thing of having lived through an epoch that's over. You get nostalgic for it, although, you know, there was an awful lot of bad things too. Actually, from the point of view of the West, it was quite a good thing, the Cold War, but I am conscious of having been very lucky to sort of been part of that history, but not affected by it, not touched by it. And having been able to have a life more or less of my own making, that people, you know, a generation earlier than mine, or 2 generations, would not have been, it would have been a struggle, and for me, it hasn't been, or not in that way. Is that?
Question on the front row.
You talked at the beginning about being close to your father. What about your mother? Or was she a closed book historically?
No, she wasn't, and I was close to her, but in my family, it was a conspiracy to admire my father. He was English in America in the 40s, and he was very good looking. He was English. He was English in Belgium in the 50s. In those days, to be English in that sort of way, and sort of to look vaguely like Anthony Eden, which now sounds absurd, but at the time it was just, and then he was rational, whereas my mother was so irrational. He spoke all the languages well. My mother spoke them less well, or she made mistakes. I don't know, it was just a conspiracy to admire my father, and I fell in with it wholeheartedly.
Nonetheless, there is a history of your mother in the book. I mean, the flyleaves of the book.
Oh, my mother was much more present as a person than my father. She was much more. Well, she was much more charming for a start.
She'd been married before.
She'd been married before. She'd been married to a cousin before, but she'd done that, as she said, to please her father. It took her to America. She'd been a student in Vienna, and then she married her first husband and went to the States. She had a much more impressive personality, a personality that made much more impression than my father had. And no, I was close to her. I complained about her. I never complained about my father. Does that answer it? Do you know the sort of situation?
I think we have time for maybe one more. And there's one towards the back in the middle there.
You mentioned nostalgia. Do you feel any sort of connection with present-day Russians? Any emotional ties with your background?
I'm not sure about that. I worry about that. I don't like what I know of present-day Russia. I mean, they've gone from no capitalism to mega capitalism in a way that is not very likable. I'd like to go back. I haven't been back for 15 years, so I don't know what it's like. But now that I've put all this behind me, I am quite interested in finding out. But
where would you go this time? Would you go to Mogilev again, or?
No, I'd go to Moscow, which is sort of what I knew. I'd quite like to go to the Azerbaijan or whatever, but I'm not sure that I ever will.
Will there be any more searching in the archives?
No.
You're done with Leonid now?
I'm done with this.
I think we're done too. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for your attention. And thank you to Mary Kate Wilmers.